Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I am Hee-Eun, President and CEO of the Center for Asia-Pacific Strategy. Welcome to the first event of our roundtable series on Asia-Pacific maritime security. Maritime security is a crucial aspect of our mission to promote democratic freedom, rules-based alliance, and coalition partnerships for stability of the Asia-Pacific region, which requires holistic approaches to long-term solutions. The topic of today's discussion is Asia-Pacific maritime security and the rules-based order in action. The points we will discuss are, first, to introduce the rules-based order, discuss what it means in theory and practice, and why it is important to maritime security. Second, we will introduce how the People's Republic of China is operating and the tactics it is using, as this gives us the opportunity to discuss gray zone tactics and why they have been successful at undermining the rules-based order without risking conflict for China. And third, we will look to shore up the rules-based order, Europe's potential role, and collective approaches to policy solutions. Today, we have world-class experts who will provide critical insight to the complexities and nuances of maritime security policy. Our speakers' first-hand engagement and insight into the issues discussed today will no doubt prove invaluable to the governments and agencies that are charged with the region's security. Many thanks to our panelists and moderator for their participation, and thank you for watching. Dr. Hemmings?
Hello, greetings, audience members, listeners, viewers. We're very happy to have you on this wonderful occasion, a panel on China and the South China Sea, hosted by the Center for Asia-Pacific Strategy. I'm Dr. John Hemmings. I'm an associate professor at the DKIA APCSS DoD Regional Center and an adjunct fellow at CSIS, a think tank in Washington. With me today are three wonderful and learned panelists who all bring an incredible wealth of experience, government policy time, and scholarly wisdom about what is possibly one of the greatest challenges of our age. Introducing them, Admiral Scott Swift has been in the US Navy as a practitioner for more than 40 years. He was at one time the commander of the Pacific Fleet, also the 7th Fleet commander. He continues to be a confidant to the highest levels of US government on this issue. Mr. Chad Subrajia is a research staff member at the Institute for Defense Analyses, where he works on US national security and defense policy. He was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and is an incredibly learned figure on China. Indeed, he was the acting director of the China Strategic Focus Group at Indo-PACOM for a number of years. And finally, Professor Peter Dutton, who is not only a great friend, but also a mentor for myself on China's approach to the maritime sphere. He has been for many years at the U.S. Naval War College. He is now acting dean, in fact, at the college, and also has a role at NYU. And with that, gentlemen, let's begin the proceedings. Peter, if I may begin with you, I think we're going to get straight to how does China see the region? We talk about the rules-based order. So could you perhaps briefly, in a minute and a half or two, walk us through what China as a continental power, how it views the current maritime space around it?
China thinks about the maritime space around it in terms of a continental power. But first, I should say, John, thanks very much for hosting us. I should say the same to Hee-Eun Kim and to the Center for Asia-Pacific Strategy. But China looks at the maritime environment as an area essential to its two things: to its own security, to its national security, but also central to its maritime expansion, to its outward projection of its power into the region and beyond. You mentioned the rules-based order, though, right? So as China is pushing its way out into the maritime domain, it's pushing on the existing rules that have governed the global maritime order. International law is based on the consent of sovereigns. It's based on sovereign agreement, and the rules that have governed in the maritime domain are rules that were developed through the treaty process and the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, and that are also reflected in customary law, which is the American approach to them. And so even as China is pushing its way outward to pursue its national interests, it's putting pressure on the interests of other states and on the stability of the region in doing so.
Thank you. Mr. Sabagia, how, for example, does the region view the rules-based order? We're looking at Southeast Asia primarily in that lens. Are they as reflective and defensive of the order as we are, or is there a sense that perhaps China's making some space with its reinterpretation of key rules in the maritime space?
Yeah, that's a great question, John. Like Peter, I'll certainly share my appreciation for you today, the fellow panelists, and also to the center for a very humbling invitation to participate. It's a great question because really this is a broader understanding about really what's at stake here is the region's perceptions, our perceptions, and China's actions and perceptions, and often lost in this in the characterization of U.S.-China strategic competition is really a better understanding is what's at stake is a broader systemic rivalry between two visions about what systems should be in place, the efficacy of them, and what stakes are at play for the regional actors in particular. And so I think it's pretty common understanding or belief amongst the regional actors is that they have a massive stake in the current system and find great favor with it, not perfect. But the concern and risk they have is the degree to which China is imposing itself and using its comprehensive national power in a manner that coerces them to accept or tolerate aspects of China's preferences in a manner that they find intolerable. And so I think that to answer your question just very simply is, yes, they have massive stakes in it. However, we have to be clear-eyed in understanding that their own levels of power and influence have limits, and that they face tremendous pressures and burdens in confronting China alone, which I think in itself kind of gives answers to some approaches for the United States in terms of how do you marshal them together? How do you find collective and integrated power? And at the end of the day, how do you marshal a better understanding about the efficacy and success of the system that's in place to withstand China's approach?
Thank you. That's quite interesting. So, Professor Dutton, going back to you very briefly, and then I want to bring Admiral Swift on this. How does China's interpretation differ from the West? What are the significant key flex points? So they have their own set of rules, and we'll get into how they're trying to apply them shortly, but how do they differ? And what are I guess before we get practical, what are the conceptual differences that are driving the tension points on the surface of the sea?
Well, really, China's approach to international law of the sea has been what I would describe as exceptional. There's a global regime that is reasonably well followed by all states around the world, and in particular, what I think China has put under pressure in ways that have caused a lot of friction in the region is by claiming history and frankly power are its exceptional rights to employ what it claims in the South China Sea as opposed to in the international law. And what I think is really an important thing, I want to pick up on what Chad was saying earlier. I think it's really important to recognize that this essentially amounts to a taking, just an abject taking of the resource rights of the other coastal states in the South China Sea based on China's sense of exceptionalism from the law itself.
This historical point, before we move on, can I just pick you up on it? You often hear the time immemorial, China has possessed this, but why don't they control things through history? Or why is that as a principle not as strong in the international rules template?
Well, I mean, there's two things to say about that. The first is China's historical claims to be entirely honest. Good research has demonstrated that they're somewhat dubious. Bill Hayton wrote a terrific book on this recently, but there's other research on this as well. But secondly, think about it. Really, in a Western European sense, how far back do we go before we say, well, all right, the Mediterranean belongs to Italy, right? Because Rome claimed it as the Central Sea. So really, that the second thing to say about it is that remember that states have agreed on what the rules are. It's international law is based on this sovereign consent and agreement. And China participated quite actively in the Third Convention on the United Nations Law of the Sea, which resulted in the convention that we're living with today. They were very active participants, and I should say, leading proponents of the concept of the exclusive economic zone in support of what was then called the G77 states, the developing and emerging states in the world. So it's a bit ironic now that on the one hand, China helped develop this, actively helped develop this regime, and at the same time is now actively undermining it to serve its own interests.
Admiral Swift, we've heard quite a bit about how rules-based system is interpreted by the West, how it's interpreted to some extent by local states, and how China seems to have its exceptional perspective. As a practitioner, can you tell our viewers, what does this look like on the ground, or how does it feel to have these rules? When you're operating in that space in the maritime domain, what is effectively occurring? How are you thinking about it? As a naval officer, what are the practical implications of the rules-based order?
Well, thanks for the question, John. And I certainly will take an editorial moment to recognize the panelists and whom I've got great respect for and know them. I think we could finish each other's sentences. But what's most important about the panelists and yourself as well, John, is that we have arguments amongst ourselves that makes us all more informed, which I think is what the Center for Asia Pacific Strategy, one of the great value that it brings to this important dialogue, this ecosystem, if you will, of think tanks. And what's critically important is the focus of the center, which has developed policy recommendations for shareholders and stakeholders alike, national shareholders and stakeholders in this space to consider. So it's not just a dialogue. The center is focused on turning that dialogue into action. Your opening of this discussion about the international rules-based order is critically important. And if I could, I'd like to pull that thread just a little bit and connect it right back to the military piece. As someone who spent 40 years in the military, I find myself in a unique position to be somewhat critical of our recent history, the U.S. recent history of leading with our military foot. I'll go back to Secretary Mattis when he was a Secretary of Defense, and the issue at the time that was most consequential and the many things that he was focused on was North Korea. And he regularly stated how important it was for people to understand that the U.S. Department of Defense was in support of State Department, that this was a diplomatic dialogue issue more than it was a military issue. And now we see the same thing with Secretary Austin and Secretary Blinken continuing to stress the importance of discourse and dialogue. The other point that I would make is that while the focus of this discussion will be largely, I suspect, on the South China Sea and the example that it presents, it's just one example. The competition is well beyond the scope of the South China Sea. It includes Taiwan, it includes Hong Kong, it includes the Senkaku's Diaoyu Islands, depending on your perspective. All these points and more are points of friction that highlight uniquely consequential and real-world competition that centers on China's understanding that their hybrid form of communists cannot compete or survive full contact with a free and open international community of democracies. This is my personal view. It's core to this challenge that we face. And most especially the international rules-based order that has governed and guided the incredible arc of prosperity that has lifted all nations from the ashes of World War II, including the PRC. The challenge, as you've rightly pointed out as the moderator, that not enough people understand how consequential this international rules-based system is. My view is that if China cannot reconcile its ability or inability to modify the international rules-based system to set the conditions necessary for something other than a free and open economic government system, which they have, to compete on that global stage, they will continue to turn to force and coercion in the knowledge that they don't have a compelling discourse or dialogue to convince the international community nations to make the necessary adaptations to adopt the PR system into their own system. This is truly what the competition is about. That's why I was so honored to be asked to participate in this panel to point out the tactical implications, as Peter just covered on UNCLOS, to the strategic implications of what this competition is about. I hope that covered your questions sufficiently.
Wonderfully, sir. Absolutely. And to some extent, I think many of our viewers will be trying to understand the shape of Chinese power. If it does indeed surpass the US economy in 15 to 20 years as predicted, what is it like to have a hegemonic power that has an exceptionalist approach towards power? And that's not to say the United States has not itself at times exercised, but it tends to have been in emergencies and not at a systemic level. So let's see if we can, I think for a lot of our viewers, that point will be a very interesting one. How does the United States differ from the PRC? And in order to understand, it seems to me that we have to understand what is China actually doing that makes it different. What is its behavior? How is it getting away with, as someone once asked me in a recent panel, how's it getting away with this? But before we get to how, let's get to what. Mr. Sabragia and then Professor Dutton, let's go to you gentlemen first. So Mr. Sabragia, what exactly is China doing on the ground? What are the steps it's taking? How would you frame them and give us a framework for what they're doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I applaud kind of starting there, and it really kind of gets after Admiral Swift's comments, which is you first got to really deeply understand what the Chinese are doing. And it is different. Reflecting what Peter had mentioned was the Chinese had been full participants in UNCLOS, the maritime regime, one of them, certainly the most prominent. But they reject that now routinely in dialogues with the Chinese. They reject them as saying as that was during a period when China was weak, and now that they're stronger, they want to have a bigger say and change the rules more towards their preference. One of the things that I like to study is actually looking about how their own internal political structures and processes have changed to enable them to get after that. And I think while maritime issues are certainly a longstanding topic within China, the recent developments to me are really fascinating and certainly indicate that there's going to be increasing friction from the top down, according to the party leadership, to achieve China's national strategic end state, which is, as I think we all know, the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. By mid-century, they have declared that it is necessary for China to become a maritime great power. Now, that terminology is really important. It talks about status and capacity, the importance of the maritime realm. Accordingly, China has an all-encompassing strategy to enlarge its maritime power, using diplomatic and informational and economic and military tools at its disposal, and has really implemented a coherent set of initiatives to promote that. Talking about things like blue economy, blue territory, China's maritime rights and interests, and as Admiral Swift said, not just at a peripheral level or even a regional level, but at a global scale. Although building China into a maritime great power is not new, really in 2013, we saw a massive reformation of all of the organs of Chinese power to consolidate them. I believe it was called the State Council Institutional Reform and Function Transformation Plan, which is consolidating all of these entities that touch on it, from military to security to rescue, all sorts of mechanisms internally, agriculture, fisheries, and so forth. In 2018, a very unique thing happened, and which is China reformed its own foreign affairs aspirations, its goal. It laid out Xi Jinping thought on foreign policy. And one of the things they did is they stood up the Central Foreign Affairs Commission, chaired by Xi. Now, within that commission, there's an office that runs that. And one of the directorates, or one of the offices in that office, is the central leading group for the protection of maritime rights and interests. And I raise this because it has now given China a comprehensive ability at a party level for coordinating all matters concerning maritime rights and interests across all organs of Chinese power. This is a remarkable capacity. First of all, it's illustrative of the priority of maritime issues to China. It certainly demonstrates the party's comprehensive approach to integrate all of its actions. And it certainly provides evidence of China seeking to reform the global rules through those tools and processes. So for me, looking about how they're doing things at a strategic level is kind of the first step in understanding how you're going to develop responses to them.
It's quite right. As far as I understand, the maritime strategy is a whole of government approach. This is not a Navy strategy. Is that right?
Correct. I actually would characterize that as a whole of nation approach. So it includes all the state organs, but it also includes social and cultural and other aspects of overall national power beyond even just the state power. So certainly the party, but the people as well. Terminology, as Admiral Swift noted, discourse power, the power to talk about terms of art, unique and specific, that are loaded language, that mean things differently to the Chinese, sometimes with the weight of law.
This is the TIFA, the concepts that are developed by the party. Professor Dutton, can we bounce off of that point into, we're talking whole of nation, but we're also seeing actors that are being very specific actors. We're thinking the maritime militias, we're thinking the Chinese Coast Guard, we're thinking the PLAN, the People's Liberation Army Navy. How are those actors executing the Chinese maritime strategy in the South China Sea? And if you can be specific, in a previous paper between us, you've talked about jurisdictional versus territorial claims that they made. And I'm going to press you on those because I always thought the way you conceptualized that was quite fascinating. So, but before we go to that, those actors.
Actually, can we address the question you first? You
want to go back? All right, go back.
So I'm gonna go back even further, right? So you asked Chad about what makes us different. I think there's something really important to think about in what makes the United States and China different. China is a continental power, and the United States is fundamentally a maritime power. We are fortunate to have essentially what geographers call an island, the opportunity of an island state to be free of threats on our border, to expand maritime power on a global basis. China has threats on its border. China has internal security problems that are bigger than its external security problems. It's a continental power that thinks in terms of possession and control for security. That's really an important distinction between a maritime state, a state that thinks about freedom and openness as essential to security, and a state that thinks about possession and control as fundamental to its security. So, and I also want to comment on what Chad said about maritime transformation. I think there's a real debate to be had about the type and the extent of China's maritime transformation. I think if we think one size maritime transformation fits all, we're not thinking correctly about it. The truth is China's pursuing a maritime expansion through what it calls a maritime transformation. But what it's doing is it's expanding as a continental power thinks, right? It's expanding in ways of possession and control, as opposed to defending an open order or strengthening an opening order. And so I think this is a really important distinction distinction. And at the root of one aspect, at least, of our strategic competition, that systemic rivalry that we've been talking about. So I'll stop there. If you want me to go further, it's up to you.
I would love to go into that, actually. Andrew Lambert, Professor Andrew Lambert, who is a superb naval theoretician at the, I believe he's at King's College London, talks about the continentalization. I mean, what do you mean when you say China looks at the sea as a land-based power? A lot of our viewers will not understand what in the heck you're talking about. So what do you mean?
Exactly what I was referring to: possession and control, as opposed to defending a strong open order. Right. That's the distinction. So the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea gives possession to coastal states of resources in specific regimes, in specific areas off their coast. But it retains the open character of the maritime domain so that all states can pursue their interests actively and freely within the maritime domain. You know, the flow of trade, the flow of finance, the flow of people, the flow of resources, all these things that are meant to enrich all states in their uses of the maritime domain are aspects of the freedom and openness that I'm referring to. When China expands into the maritime domain, it increasingly attempts to assert physical control over what goes on within the spaces it's expanding into. And I think it's a really important observation if we're trying to figure out what the limits of China's maritime expansion are. And I think it's the limits of what they can control from the continent, given the mindset that I think they possess. Does that address?
Perfect. You wrapped it up. There's a rabbit hole called Mare Liberum, freedom of the seas, and a lot of the basis of UNCLOS and the origin of the European approach towards the seas that we could go down. But I encourage our viewers to perhaps look up Grotius themselves, the famous Dutch international lawyer of the seas. Admiral Swift, I'd like to go to you to the question that I bandied about there, and you know, China's actors on the ground. We're looking at militias. We're looking at PLAN. We're looking at the MFA. You've often pointed out, and I think very well, that this whole of nation approach means that China is much more adept at creating moments of opportunity in the South China Sea, as well as, and so how are they doing that, and how are we failing to respond well in that space?
Well, in a nutshell, we're a democracy, and China isn't. You know, I blame you, John, and your heritage, and Churchill's comment about democracies are, you know, a challenge to deal with and a challenge to be a part of, but nothing else comes close. And so this is back to a term that I'm using more often now. As people talk about, we need to be faster. What I'm suggesting is what we need is more velocity. It's not enough to be fast. We need a vector, a direction, and that direction is framed in the context of a strategic vision. And so what needs to happen is, as a democracy, we need to think strategically, plan operationally, and act tactically. And what I see is an awful lot of thinking, planning, and acting tactically, and not understanding how we can't get out ahead of a competitor who makes the rules. You mentioned it before, that you know, the US has bent the rules from time to time. That world is gone. You know, there's an incredible leveling that has occurred. You know, many people have written books about it. You know, the earth is flat. From a governance perspective, in a lot of ways, that's true. What I see happening, I see this drive on the part of China, is establishing, and this is, I think, what Peter was driving to, and I think Chad mentioned it as well, is establishing national sovereignty in what has been accepted as international sovereign space. Now, there is a process that if you disagree with the definition of what your own sovereignty is, how that is constrained by land borders, which I think Peter is right. This is how China thinks in the context of expanding its maritime borders. It thinks of it in a terrestrial kind of way, claiming territory, if you will. There's a process. The international rules-based system has an adjudication process that has served us well since the end of World War II in reconciling these differences. I'll use an example, Vietnam. Vietnam has claims that the United States think exceeds the international rules-based order, UNCLOS in particular. But Vietnam has embraced discourse and dialogue to make their case, as have the Philippines. China uses force and coercion. To Chad's point, they don't have a compelling story. They've turned to history, as Peter has discussed, as a mechanism to justify the claims that they make, but invariably they need a strong military standing behind it, which is why you see them making those investments. I'm not sure I fully answered your question previously as a naval practitioner. How important our rules are? It's critically important because we need to make sure there's not a tactical miscalculation in any domain. But the domain of warfare that is most fluid is the maritime domain. And a tactical trigger there can create strategic implications that forces the US, China, other countries to act in their own national interest. It constrains the ability to respond. This is why this discussion about rules is so critically important and that we understand it.
Admiral, you told me very recently, and I ask you if you can remember this for our audience, which is the wonderful point that when the US makes a FONOP, there tends to be a public affairs officer who comments, and how does the PRC respond? Can you take us through, because for me, it's a very granular, but superb example of how the US approach differs from the PRC approach on the ground in the South China Sea.
Well, out of that conversation has come, you'll be shocked to hear this, more thinking on my part. Your academic approach and pulling apart positions that people take, myself included, have resulted in my expanded thinking on that. There's 3 points that I would make. I won't share all 3 of them with you with respect to how China thinks, and I think that the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party, and rightfully so. I think we say China too much. I've been doing it here just in this discussion. When we talk about China, when we as Americans talk about China, we're often talking about the Chinese Communist Party. I think a more appropriate term is the People's Republic of China, which I think is the instrument of the Chinese Communist Party. But 2 points that the Chinese Communist Party makes with respect to its own legitimacy in the eyes of the Chinese people is reversing the 100 years of humiliation, 1. And number 2 is making sure that the sovereignty of China is never contested again, is never violated. This ties back to FONOPS. So when the United States conducts a FONOPS, we need to be careful to understand that there are 2 elements of that FONOPS that we are calling into question, in my mind, the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party itself. And that is, we are demonstrating that in their vernacular, not ours, but in the Chinese voiceover, that the 100 years of humiliation is still real. They're not able to reverse that. And we're challenging their definition of what sovereignty is. Our allies, partners, and friends are cautious about the term freedom of navigation operations, and including our British friends. Very interesting to see the current deployment of Queen Elizabeth II in the context. We are challenging the positions that an authoritarian government is making vis-a-vis China, but our approach is different, and rightfully so. In direct answer to your question, as we try to encourage allies and partners in the fact that the U.S. has a responsible role to play in the Pacific and are filling that role, the current approach to FONOPS is not sufficient. Peter, I think he may have changed his voiceover, but at one point, I think in testimony in Congress, he made the comment that FONOPs are necessary but insufficient. One of the insufficiencies, in my view, is the voiceover behind them. When we conduct a FONOP, when the US does, it is either the foreign minister himself or the foreign ministry, the spokesman for the ministry, that characterizes China's issue with that specific FONOP. And often that's the first indication that a FONOP has occurred. I say that China can't wait for the next FONOP because it's making their case for them. On the US side, the vast majority of time, the response comes from the public affairs officer of the Seventh Fleet. This causes concern and uncertainty of our allies, partners, and friends when they see this strategic disconnect, that the response comes from the foreign ministry of China on one side and from the Seventh Fleet commander on the other. These are military operations that are conducted in support of US national policy, which is the domain of the State Department. It's the State Department that should be commenting on. So there are things that we can be doing now collectively. I'll go back to, and I'll stop on this point. Others have much more important things to say than I do. When you made the comment, what makes us different? You were comparing the US to China. The us is now a royal us. No longer is it the US by itself. You also made the comment that the Chinese economy will surpass the US economy. It may, but my response is, so what? National power isn't measured just on economic power. It's measured on relevancy in the eyes of the global community. Look at the partners that gravitate towards us, that despite an inward turn, in my opinion, recently from a US policy perspective. Compare that to the partners that gravitate towards the Chinese model and embrace the Chinese form of government. So we need to take a much more broader perspective of the actions that we take. Think strategically, plan operation, act tactically. FONOPs are a critical element of that process, but it's not the element. And even within that element, we can do better.
Wonderful comments, Admiral Swift. And I really appreciate you introducing the concept of legitimacy into this, because it strikes me that both sides are attempting to legitimize their preferred orders. But actually, the US preferred order is an ancient one that has been collectively built and developed by a host of nations, many of them European, but also in the 20th century, many of them non-European, including the Chinese themselves under this party have been a part of that construction. I still want to drill down, and I'm not going to stop till you answer me. How are the Chinese doing what they're doing, and what are they doing? Let's get into this meat and potatoes. I know for a lot of you, this will be, we're at the political level. I'm thinking Scarborough model. That's a thing, right? Some of our viewers won't even know what that is, but for me, it's a physical demonstration of the tactics that are applied. Who would like to have a go at
John,
explaining that? Sir.
Let me jump in on that, because I have much more respect for Chad and Peter's insights on this issue. So I'm not an expert in anything, but I've got a lot of experience, and I describe myself as a practitioner. So let me share a few thoughts on this point about how China is able to do it. One is they have an authoritarian government. The other is, it truly is, as Chad mentioned, and I think Peter as well, it is all about the Chinese Communist Party. The People's Republic of China is just an instrument of the party. And so they have a grand strategy. I argue, Peter and I have had this conversation. Feel free not to argue with me on this in public, Peter. But my personal view is that we as Americans do not have a grand strategy. I think Peter would argue that it's baked into how we think as Americans, and he has an excellent point there. I think we're moving in that direction. It's got to come from the government with a lot of help from academia and other places. And then from that grand strategy is developed a regional strategy. So that's part of how China is able to move with such velocity, the centrality of their government, the authoritarian nature of it, the fact that it's all about the party, the power, the sustained power of the party, and the fact that they fully control the media. So the messages that the public gets, that the Chinese people get, is the message that the government wants them to get in support of this grand strategy and regional strategy. Grand strategy, the globalist approach that China is taking, regional strategy, the approach that they're taking in the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, Africa, Europe, EU, NATO. I mean, you see how the story unfolds from there. But I think the velocity that they're able to maintain is going to continue just because of the centrality of power that's incumbent within their governance structure and the disaggregation of power that's incumbent to democracies. We give it to the people. And, you know, I've got a brother-in-law who's in the seafood industry. He doesn't understand my concern with respect to the controls of business rules. It's not just the maritime domain, as Chad was alluding to. It's all domains that we find ourselves in this competition in. So the opportunity to unpack this, I think, is critically important. And I look forward to Chad and Peter's comments on this question, which I think is critically important.
Thank you, sir. I think we'll start with Mr. Sabrigi and then we'll go to Professor Dutton. Scarborough model, Chinese actors. We've heard a really excellent exposition on the political framework that is allowing the PRC to move this. Take us on the ground, take us tactically. Mr. Sabrigi.
Yeah, that's great. You know, I think we have to begin, as Admiral Swift talked about, is all of the organs of Chinese power that you see expressed, they do work in unison. Now, they're not perfect. There's always a risk of building them up too much. They have inefficiencies and shortfalls. And frankly, sometimes the initiatives or policy approaches the Chinese take fail. But they change, they shift, they adapt, and they get better. What's unique is just how integrated they are and how much more integrated they're becoming. So the things in the South China Sea, Scarborough is a good example, is the diplomatic alignment of how they message, the informational arguments they're using through their discourse system and lexicon, the military assets, the non-military or paramilitary assets that they're using and applying, and the economic coercion all being unified together coherently through a strategic approach to get after things really matters. At the end of the day, I think in the United States, to draw a distinction is the military would be told to act in the United States to serve a military end or a diplomatic end from diplomacy or an economic end. But at the end of the day, of the Chinese initiatives that seek to move forward all share a common end state, and it's a political end state, right? It's an end state for the senior leadership of the party to get after a national strategic ambition. And they apply those different tools in a coherent manner to achieve those end states. A good example of that is something like the BRI, the Belt Road Initiative. It's an initiative. It serves many functions, most of which at the top end is China's three national interests: national sovereignty, security, and developmental interests. Those are the ones that they talk about most often and coherently. And you can see that initiative supports all of those. First and foremost, it's not an economic initiative as a priority. It's a political initiative to seek and attain China's long-term national aspirations. And in the Scarborough case that you raised is a perfect example about it. It's not just about a spit of dirt in the middle of the South China Sea, right? It's about authority and legitimacy, about having its way, about redefining the rules, about establishing control, as was mentioned, through and I do share Peter Dutton's view about this continental approach. Now they think about that is this is not the same view of maritime, the maritime realm as common other places. They think about it as blue territory, right? Is literally a territorial expansion of this continental power and the expression of the tools and their visions for how they use it. So that's really the distinction that I see from the Chinese, is just this coherence in the sense of unified purpose of what they have that's their favor. I think it's important to add, though, as imperfect as China can be at sometimes, is that there really is a case to be made that unified responses tend to actually have some effect in either shifting the Chinese approach, pressuring them, or at least mitigating it in certain ways. So, kind of standing up to these tactics does have an effect. And so the yardstick by which you measure the Chinese success is often the yardstick by which you measure the failure of the United States and others in the region to unify and align themselves to withstand that. And I think that helps give clues about what you need to do about it next, which is stop thinking about only countering China and start thinking much more about how you unify the United States, to Admiral Swift's point, not with the military always being the leading element, but to be a supporting element, leading with the diplomatic, the acts of state, and unifying that to uncover and kind of solidify the foundations of the rule sets as being what we're defending, not necessarily even the regional actors themselves or countering China, but the rules. The rules are what you're defending in that case. So, and I'll pause there.
Thank you. If I understand correctly, you raised the point about military actors and non-military actors, and of course, you're not just talking about the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the information campaign, but also on the ground, we're talking about the militias. In the Scarborough model, how do they affect change on the ground? De facto sea control rather than de jure. What's the how as this fellow which I discussed, how are they getting away with it? How are they avoiding conflict? What is this tactic that they're using with the militias? Mr. Sabragia, we'll push that back at you.
The militias, and I'll expand that out to, there's a lot of layers here between their gray holes, their official, PLA Navy, between the maritime militias, which are associated with them, but even the fishing fleets themselves, which are more distantly related, but often act in a manner that's coherent with an integrated approach. And what ends up happening is, as the Chinese provide direction or guidance out from a party to go after and take on these things, the Chinese are very, very attentive to risks of escalation, but they know kind of one of the secret approaches is if they just came in bald-faced with gray holes, is that could trigger an escalatory response that would help marshal a unified response to them. But the slower or lesser types of vessels that can act in a coherent manner creates problems because there's not a like-minded solution for the regional actors or the United States to respond to that. The tools that the United States primarily has at its disposal for cases like that is the Seventh Fleet. And the policy conundrum that you run into is what's the perceptions of taking Seventh Fleet warships and applying them against a vessel, despite being a maritime militia vessel, often, or Coast Guard. It looks bad. It's a bad optic. It looks escalatory. It looks out of place. And so the Chinese have found that that's an interesting technique to use. Gray holes for them are always over the horizon. And so it's integrated, but you're going to have to figure out different techniques and tools to do this. I think it's worth bringing up one of the key aspects is, and Admiral Swift had touched on this, is there's a similarity here to the Senkakus, where in the case of Japan, the Japanese do certainly have a much more robust non-military or Coast Guard capacity here. And it's the professionalism and the kind of attentiveness of those kind of forces of counteracting that prevents the Chinese from being able to succeed fully in what their aspirations are there. And I think that might help give us some models about what you need to do, which is we have to introduce new tools, help fund and pay and train them, and understand how you integrate them more broadly so that you don't have either kind of an on and off switch as you do with most military assets alone.
That's a superb answer, sir, and also very helpful for us because you've linked back to the legitimacy aspect that Admiral Swift raised earlier, which again, not only is the PRC trying to project that it is a legitimate holder of these expanded rights, but that when the United States does FONOPS and shows gray hull, that it is acting in a destabilizing manner. And in some senses, it is also a legitimacy narrative war that's taking place. And very, very well brought out by you, I think. Professor Dutton, I know you've been working extensively on the concept gray zone recently, and I would love to hear your thoughts, perhaps in response to what Mr. Sabragia said.
Actually, I'd like to start by going back to Admiral Swift's term of strategic vision. Really, what we're talking about is a common strategic vision, right? For how you resolve disputes. It gets right to this term of legitimacy as well. there's really a spectrum of dispute resolution processes. There's bilateral negotiations, of course, or even multilateral negotiations. There's use of multilateral institutions, and then a third way, of course, is through dispute resolution mechanisms like adjudication or arbitration, mediation, conciliation. There's a whole range of tools available that are all considered legitimate. These are the common strategic vision that most countries share about how to resolve disputes. And these are all legitimate approaches to resolving these disputes. So, and so legitimacy is at the heart of this issue of gray zone, because fundamentally is looking for gaps, in as Chad's already pointed out. One of them is the gap in capability, right? So the United States has gray holes in the region. So China stays below the threshold for our involvement in, with gray holes. But still pursues what I've called non-militarized coercion underneath the level of bumping up against that military threshold. So this non-militarized coercion ends with China's redefinition of the space. That's the first, really most important key. And this is where it ties back to what we were talking about earlier about history. So China says historically this was ours. Whether that's true or not is not even relevant. China says historically the space was ours. We're going to continue to claim it as ours, and we're going to put it in our domestic law. That's actually the second and really critical component, that China uses its own domestic law as the ultimate authority, even in international space, as opposed to acknowledging international law as having primacy in international space. So it puts in domestic law that it is the owner of this blue territory, as we've been describing, and then it energizes its capabilities to enforce its control in this region that it has transformed through its domestic law from say Vietnam's exclusive economic zone to Chinese space. And then it portrays any pushback as aggression. It's literally flipped the table, right? So in what I think is fair to call quasi-aggression, China's whole strategy, its whole policy for how it enhances its. I'm using the South China Sea as the example, but this is a very similar approach to what China's doing in the East China Sea as well. And by flipping through the sleight of hand of applying domestic law and then applying its own law enforcement mechanisms to then also portray the rightful owner's pushback as aggression is the essence of the gray zone strategy, right? So looking for not just an operational gap, but a gap in where international law leaves some question because where there is actually dispute over the nature of the the maritime space, law has never actually quite dealt with a circumstance like this to, other than to say it should be moved into the either negotiations or institutional approaches or dispute resolution processes like arbitration. And so China uses power-based approaches that are outside the process of legitimacy that we've been discussing. I've got a research project on this that I'm working on at NYU, and I've called it testing the boundaries, right? So it's not just testing the boundaries of the maritime lines and how you redraw those. It's testing the boundaries of the capacity of international law to resolve disputes for states, powerful states, that simply refuse to participate. So there's various ways in which China is testing the boundaries of our collective will, testing the boundaries of our ability to rely on international law and peaceful dispute resolution processes, testing the boundaries of what we've got available to push back in what it's doing. I think it's an important thing to understand that this gray zone that China has created in the maritime domain in the South China Sea and in the East China Sea is one that we have to think systematically about how to push back. We've got to understand the gap in which China is operating. I think I've tried to lay it out here just in a few sentences. But we've got to understand that gap so that we can bring the right tools to bear. And Chad's exactly right, I think, when he says fundamentally, the best way to deal with this is by strengthening the coastal states that have the most interest at stake. Start there. Start by strengthening our partners. Admiral Swift refers to them as allies, partners, and friends. Start by strengthening our allies, partners, and friends in the region, and then support them. Support them not just with the United States, but this is something that all states that share this common strategic vision about how international order should proceed can support this approach as well. And I particularly want to reference the fact that the UK, France, and Germany have all, among other countries, have all recently been moving into a more supportive posture in this. Even though they're physically far away, they recognize the importance of the regime, and I think that's exactly the right thing to do because they're reinforcing the common strategic vision about how to provide stability that brings peace and prosperity on a global basis when that vision is shared.
Gentlemen, you've all done an incredible job of laying out the rules-based order. Just to briefly summarize, and then we're going to go really hard and deep into response. We've laid out a China that views the sea the way it views land, as something to possess and hold. You've laid out an authoritarian system and the way that they've been able to use all metrics of state power and all organs of state power, including a national approach towards maritime strategy, and that's implementation in the South China Sea when it's taking territory. You've laid out the way they use legitimacy arguments to control the narrative and control the pace of activity in the South China Sea using gray zone tactics, avoiding gray hulls, compelling us to. And you've also laid out, to some extent, the way that they've salami sliced their way to success. You've begun already, and I'm really grateful to all of you for foreshadowing the ways that we can respond. Professor Dutton, you've just come out with, of course, that this is not a US problem. This is a collective issue. Mr. Sabragia, you've also talked to the regional response, the maritime domain awareness efforts that the US has tried to this capacity building. And Admiral Swift, you've talked about how the internal US approach could be about modifying this and making it more not a military thing, which I think is absolutely brilliant and right on. So I'm going to go to Admiral Swift, and we're going to dig a bit further into ways that the US can modify its policy approach. And I'd like Professor Dutton and Mr. Sabragia to be thinking, expanding a little bit on your initial thoughts on the two areas that you've already brought up in terms of policy options. And you can be as blue sky as you need to, put out some ideas and notions that you might be playing with. But for those practitioners and policymakers who are familiar with the South China Sea and who've been kicking themselves thinking, what do we do? How do we respond to this new type of aggression that seems to be winning? Admiral Swift, you have had a privileged place in US policymaking circles on the South China Sea. Can I begin with you, sir, and hear your thoughts on how we might reapproach this issue?
Well, I think the answer is already contained in comments that have been made, specifically with respect to Chad's comments. He has, of all of us, has spent the most significant and consequential time on the policy side of U.S. government, and perhaps that's where these perspectives that he shared has come from. And Peter as well. I mentioned he's often sought after to testify in government testimony based on his expertise. So I apologize to both of them as if it appears I'm hijacking some of their views and
We'll
offer them the opportunity to take ownership of them. There's a couple of points that I would make on this. And one is, I think we're as in good a place today as we have been maybe in the last 10 years. I mean, when the Senkaku, when the Scarborough Shoal incident occurred, I was the 7th Fleet commander. And as Chad pointed out, what we saw is a rapid unfolding of events. And in my opinion, they were pre-planned. And this is the ability that we have to get beyond the objective perspective, the sense of what's measurable, and that tells us what's happening today, and get to that's the objective analysis, what's happened and why. We need to get to the subjective analysis about what could happen. I think that's where the PRC was with respect to the Senkaku. So in hindsight, we saw all the pieces, but we didn't understand how it played together. About 2 months after that incident, I was having a discussion with some Japanese friends, peers of mine at the time. And I'm not taking credit for the term. It may have been, I don't remember the timing of it, but I used the characterization of the Senkaku incident. At the time, the mayor of Tokyo was mounting an effort to become prime minister. And he had made the comment about that he wanted to buy the Senkakus from the owners and essentially nationalize it in his name. This, in my opinion, was a bridge too far for China, for the PRC, and caused them to act. This was roiling at the time, and my comment to my JMSDF friends was that I would not be surprised to see the same model, the Scarborough Shoal model, applied in the Senkakus, where you'd see the presence of these fishing boats as the leading edge, with a PLAN 80-kilometer standoff sending a clear signal that these efforts were being supported by the Chinese Communist Party, the People's Republic of China. And in fact, that's what happened. So to your point of what do we do? It is the People's Armed Forces Maritime Militia. I mean, this is they get their power directly from the president of China. He takes a personal interest in them. Andrew Erickson, a colleague of Peter's at the Center for Maritime Studies Institute there at CMSI at the Naval War College, is a resident expert on the platform. So the first thing is to expand our horizon, to think more subjectively than just objectively. You know, what does this mean more broadly? And I think the government is in a much better position. A comment that Chad made earlier to your question of getting down to the tactical leeches. I happen to be writing another paper, and I have the quote here. This is what Secretary Austin, part of his comments, and this is lifted directly, one follows the other, at the Indo-PACOM change of command. He said, and I'm quoting now, and deterrence now depends on far more coordination, innovation, and cooperation from us all. This is an international audience that he was talking to. From us all is not just the U.S. military, it's a U.S. whole of government, and with allies, partners, and friends, as Peter pointed out. Picking up the quote again, under this integrated deterrence, the U.S. military isn't meant to stand apart, but to buttress U.S. diplomacy and advance a foreign policy that employs all instruments of our national power. That gets to the how point of your question, John. So this isn't something new. We just haven't been in this space for a long time. Prime Minister Abe, free and open Indo-Pacific. There are elements that we need to embrace. It doesn't have to have a U.S. stamp on it. What it has to have is the unanimity of the international system, dependent upon the international rules-based system that we talked about earlier. One point before I close on this point is deterrence. And what I wrote as I was listening to Chad and Peter's comments is deterrence depends on the legitimacy as determined by external observers, shareholders, and stakeholders. So your question is critically important. It's not just F-35s, an incredible tactical platform. What does it mean strategically? It's not just the Queen Elizabeth deployment. What does that say strategically from the perspective of there's a US DDG that's a permanent part of that strike group. There's Marine F-35s involved, and yet they're integrated from European countries to the Indo-Pacific, Middle East. These are the types of actions that we need to move beyond the one-offs. We need to embrace them as a collective. They should be occurring on a regular basis, sending a message that we're together in this. The royal we, again, it's not just us as the United States, it's like-minded countries that have concerns about the mechanism by which the rules-based system is changing. It's okay to change the international rules-based system, but it's changed through discourse and dialogue, not through force and coercion.
I couldn't agree more, sir. And in fact, I think it was from you that I first heard the idea of multi-flagging, vessels, so that you had, one ship goes through the South China Sea, but it has French, British, Dutch flag officers on board. It makes the Chinese response more careful because they're dealing with three countries, and their response and their, I suppose, the punishment strategies that they often use, particularly in the economic sphere, can get complicated by that, which is useful for us. It's our own, it's our own complex approach, which makes them push back. They're not quite as confident when we respond that way. And as to your point with the U.S. Marine Corps F-35s on the UK aircraft carrier, it's a complex problem for the Chinese. They can't simply punish the British as they've tended to threaten in the past. Mr. Sabragia, your points, as you were Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, I mean, how did you think about policy approaches, both for the United States and collectively? And can you share any insights from that period for us on where you think we should be going?
Yeah, it's good. I wish I could report I was more successful than I actually was, but I'll tell you is that I share a lot of thinking with Admiral Swift, and certainly in my advocacy then, and that continues now. One, and there's a couple of issues related to really this kind of militarization of this issue that I think puts us at risk. And the first is the precision of language and the rationale for why the United States wants anybody else to get involved. There's a lot of evidence that it's actually driving ally and partner and friend hesitancy to participate more. I understand that the German, French, and British excursions through the region ostensibly look or symbolic of greater kind of military participation, and it's true, but none of those are funds, right? None of those are freedom of navigation operations, or very few cases of that. Australians, Canadians, and others. And so what you're actually seeing is, even if there's a slight uptick in military activity, there's actually kind of a retraction of gaining more military assets or capabilities in the region to resist the Chinese. And this is inadvertently kind of facilitating Chinese opinion, as you're driving the propensity for these nations to use their own militaries to stand up. So I think there's a great risk there. And one of the drivers of that is because some of the greatest calls for action are really coming out of the DoD. It's not coming out of other elements of the United States leadership. It looks like a military issue. And I think that this kind of informs us is that, to compel the State Department and others to minimize or downplay the DoD response, which is a military act, and instead make it acts of state, and instead prioritize issues like reinforcing international rule sets for maritime behavior and action, not as an act of military, but as an act of state. And I think that there's some things you can do there. One of the reasons is because the U.S. military has a deterrence mission and to prevail in conflict. And you have to be very cautious of now constraining it by only being as a tool of expressing international law. It should act in accordance with international law. But at the end of the day, the U.S. Department of Defense job is to defend the United States. It needs to fly, sail, and operate anywhere international law allows, and doesn't conduct fawn ops because exclusively for the U.S. military. It conducts fawn ops for the U.S. State Department. The Seventh Fleet doesn't need permission from state or anybody else to fly through those territories or to be conducting a fawn to do so, right? It can fly and sail and operate in those areas because that's afforded them the ability to do that by international law. I think what that tells us is you have to start using the military, or facilitating is bolstering the law. So facilitating the region and putting rules into practice is as much of countering China is important as countering China's malevolent practices. And a good example of this, some have already been given, but anytime that the region is not practicing these international rules, it actually favors the Chinese. And a good example is that when we conduct fawn ops, we conduct them against the Vietnamese, the Filipinos, and the Chinese all simultaneously with their overlapping claims. Well, if we could marshal an effort to facilitate, for example, Vietnam and the Philippines to delimit their claims and submit those through unclassed procedures, there would be a reinforcement of why the rule of law is important, and that those two actors are acting in accordance with rule of law. I think what you would end up doing is drawing a distinction, because China won't do that. But as long as those other nations don't practice those either, it allows or enables or facilitates the Chinese to kind of operate within this more chaotic environment where nobody's following these rules. And so that may be a first step for us, is to look at something like that, where we facilitate. Maybe we help fund the research vessels and secure them as they conduct the delimitation, and then submit them and back them when they do so. So that we're reinforcing the law, moving it away from a militarized issue and moving it more into a state and law issue. Diplomatic sanction regimes, economic and diplomatic costs being incurred are another tool for us as well. It can't always be the Seventh Fleet, imposing costs on the Chinese. It has to be integrated with these other costs. And there's some evidence of recent practices for doing so. Sanctioning, economic sanctions, political sanctions, diplomatic sanctions against companies operating on the Chinese behalf in the South China Sea. Those actually have had an effect. So I think that an expansion of those in collaboration with our allies and partners draws other elements of power of all of our nations into this, rather than making it a military-facing effort only. So I didn't like us using military only as the face of, in this case, fawns. Is it has to come from a different element, and we need to continue to pursue that, I think.
Superb, sir. I was actually going to draw out from you the economic side, but you more than dealt with it, and absolutely it has to be a measurement against all sectors of government if we were to respond to the PRC's approach. I'll go to Professor Dutton, and we are approaching the time that we had set ourselves. So I'd like for all three panelists to think about some summarizing remarks. Maybe 2 minutes each would be really workable. We've discussed three things for our audience today. We've discussed what the rules-based order is, what China's doing to undermine it and how, and three, what we should do about it. So if you can perhaps summarize your points on those three in 2 minutes, and you can go over a little, I'd be very happy. But before we do that, let's please hear Professor Dutton. You haven't really had a chance to come in on what can we do, either individually as the United States or collectively. And to our audience, by the way, we will have another event that actually drills down more deeply into the French, German, and UK approach towards the South China Sea. So if you're very curious about that issue, that is a scheduled event by the Center for Asia Pacific Strategy that is to come. Professor Dutton, what should we be doing?
Two for the price of one, right? I'll make these my summarizing comments.
Okay.
So you asked initially, sort of what are some of the policy recommendations that I would have, and as I was framing them in my mind too, I split them into diplomatic and informational, military and economic, and I'll address them in that way. So in terms of diplomatic and informational approaches to policy, I want to say first and foremost, what we need to do is to continue to reinforce that shared strategic, or that common strategic vision that we talked about, both in our diplomacy and in the way we help to message, with our allies, partners, and friends. We've got to continue to build and reinforce that long-term strategic vision. I recognize that all countries engage with China, trade with China, have economic interests and other interests related to China, and that includes the United States, and that's the way it will always be. And our policies need to recognize the inextricability of the relationships between China and other countries. I think that's a really important thing to recognize. Even as we build our common strategic vision, we need to recognize the other pressures that come from policy trade-offs that every capital has to make. And so building that strategic vision is the starting point. But then we have to operationalize that. Now, I'm not a big fan, as both Admiral Swift and Chad have said. We often use the military as the fundamental approach to policy, when I think it may be another way of looking at it is, rather than DIME, it's DIOE, operational. What can we do that's operational in relationship to our policy? Well, information sharing is certainly one of those things. I've already talked about capacity building with our partners and friends in this larger strategic vision that we're trying to establish. So those are examples. But I also think that economically we need to, although most countries now continue to rely on their trade with China, there still has to be economic consequences for egregious behavior. We've seen that we can do this. We've done it in relationship to Xinjiang. And to a certain degree, Hong Kong, but primarily the Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs. This is, we have to respond economically with China's, where China's behavior is particularly egregious. And this requires all countries to consider at times their longer term interests rather than their shorter term economic interests. So economic consequences for egregious behavior is something that I'm a supporter with. Now, that's not to say the military doesn't have an important role. I think we need to maintain the strongest deterrent capacity that we can, recognizing that it's, deterrence is part of a joint, the U.S. joint force, and critically, it's joint, the U.S. joint force in combination with all our allies, partners, and friends in the region that helps to deter. And all together, these things are deterrent. Deterrence is not just a military issue. It's how you put together the commonality of perception, the building legitimacy of what it is that you're trying to achieve, and then operationalizing that and strengthening it with military and economic tools. Now, I want to end with one thought. Thomas Schelling showed us that deterrence is not just about power. Coercion is an element of deterrence, but reassurance is also a secondary element of insurance. And there are at least three things that I think we need to add into the way we are approaching China. That we're not out our objective is not to undermine the Chinese Communist Party and cause it to fail. That is for the Chinese people to choose or not to choose, not for the rest of the world. That is reassurance number one. Reassurance number two is we're not trying to prevent China's rise. I think, frankly, the last 30 or 40 years are key demonstration that the rest of the world has not attempted to prevent China from economically strengthening itself to the limits of its capability, and frankly, not just China benefits from that, but we all do. And so we're not trying to prevent China's rise, but we do. The third thing we need to reassure them of is that we would welcome them into a position of responsible stakeholder. I like that term. To be a responsible stakeholder on the system that we've all been describing here today. These are three reassurances that we ought to continually add into our messaging as we seek to not only build a coalition of like-minded strategic partners, but to reinforce and build on that coalition. And we will have a much stronger deterrent posture if not only are we providing the coercive elements, but the reassurance elements of necessary in order to achieve an effective deterrent policy. So,
are those reassurances to China publicly made so that the international audience is aware of them, or do you think they should be behind the scenes?
The three that I've laid out, at least, are there's absolutely no reason, absolutely no reason. We should not reassure the CCP that it is not our policy to achieve regime change. That is for the Chinese people to decide. Secondly, that we're not attempting to prevent China's rise to the limits of its own economic abilities. And third, that we welcome them as responsible stakeholders. Those are three things that should be very easy for any American government to offer.
And there's a wonderful discussion on how China's conflated, this is a digression, containment from stopping China's expansion. They've reshifted the definition to stopping China's rise, which has never been a Western ambition. I'll go to Mr. Sabragia, and then we'll end with Admiral Swift, who will have the final note. So Mr. Sabragia, your 2 minutes, please, sir.
Yeah, I really found a lot of favor in Peter's comments, and I'll add just a couple short pieces to that, and a little bit different train of thought. One is, we have a pretty clear understanding of where China wants to go. If you take a look at their long-term their mid-century aspirations and what status they hope to achieve, to include in this realm. But I think that it would be gross malpractice if we didn't take the lessons that we've learned to date, particularly for the maritime regime, specifically in the South China Sea, and didn't understand that the Chinese, with some changes, will try to start applying those practices in other areas, the Indian Ocean, the Gulf, the Mediterranean, the Caribbean. I mean, these areas are at risk. Certainly, the western coast of Africa, and you're already seeing early touches of that with fishery expansion, illegal fishing, and all kinds of other behavior. But the other acts of China to safeguard its own interests are coming. And so if we don't take the lessons learned from the last 10 to 20 years and start putting in place those features in those other areas now, we're going to be having the same conversation 10 years from now in the same problem in those areas as well. So we should be thinking strategically, have a vision, and kind of getting ahead of that. So setting those conditions now to our favor. The second is to really kind of continue to try to recast this challenge from a condition where it's a US-China problem, and instead it's a China versus the current global order problem. Because that's really what it is. I think the best characterization of that is a systemic rivalry, a rivalry from two different visions. One, because I think that'll permits others to kind of onboard and assume their own current stake in the current system and the efficacy of that system, vice the efficacy of the model that the Chinese are proposing. And that's really where the battle is at right now. We do disservice, I think, when we permit it to be characterized only as a bilateral problem. And the last one is just the better ability by the United States to articulate, while it is now and increasingly will be so in the future, important for others to start valuing their security stakes, at least in part, in their economic policy calculus. I see that quite often when we talk to our global partners about why they should invest more, particularly in the Indo-Pacific, invest more from their own ministries of defense or militaries. And oftentimes it was, to very well-attuned ears in those other regimes, defense establishments or security establishments, but they very often felt like they just didn't have a compelling argument of why those should have a priority, or at least even be recognized because of the importance of economic policy priorities in those other countries. And so that's really up to us to help better articulate, security is an element of economic prosperity, particularly long term, and help them move that through their systems and help them connect that with them, especially as you look into the out years. But it's just not enough to yell or push or try to influence or get frustrated by our allies and partners. They have real priorities and real governance and real calculus that they're doing. And our job should be helping to inform them and link those things together. And I think we do a disservice when we reduce it to kind of a one-dimensional argument of, well, we think that your security efforts should be in the Indo-Pacific, and you should just do that. Well, that's not good enough for them. So we have to figure out a better argument, a better logic here of linking those things together. And I think that's doable. And I'll pause there. So.
Well said, sir. And in fact, I think I would 100% agree with you, and both Professor Dutton and Admiral Swift have been eloquent arguments in that favor in the UK context, and have both been able to speak to the UK Parliament in ways that I think did not hector the UK, but actually tried to raise the issues in a way that, and we should continue working on that. Admiral Swift, you have the final word, sir. What should we be doing and thinking?
Well, before I get into that, I'd just like to come back to the comment that Chad made about how do we increase, as Peter alluded to, I like to frame it in the context of allies. Those are allies are determined from a U.S. perspective by treaties that we've actually signed and negotiated. Partners are those that we exercise with on a regular basis, but we don't have treaties with. And friends are like-minded and non-like-minded countries that we should be teaming with. I think Chad is exactly right. Peter brought up the EU framework with respect to China. It is a written document. It's compelling. It's well done, and it's being put into action. This is the point that Chad's making. So this is low-hanging fruit that's out there right now. We shouldn't be wringing our hands about trying to create opportunities in the near term for greater stability in the future, certainly more stability than we have now. There are opportunities there. So in summary, I would say this, is I continue to be enamored with the concept of thinking strategically, planning operationally, and acting tactically, and at least stop thinking, planning, and acting tactically. If that strategic thinking strategically creates a vision which allows us to move beyond just going faster. We need to be faster. We need to be faster with a vector. What we need is increased velocity, which is what I hear Chad and Peter talking about. The world is much flatter than it ever has been. We went to a polarized world with centrality of power being absolutely national. And now we've moved back to the flatter context, just the leveling effect of information flow around the world, how rapid it is and how influential it is, whether it's valid or not, that information. People are influenced and they act according to that. So I think it's important that we need to acknowledge that, certainly as Americans. We need to spend more time listening, processing what we hear, and then developing actions from that. It's with, by, and through those allies, partners, and friends in the region. And I like the combination of term, both shareholders and stakeholders. Shareholders are those that have an interest from an intellectual perspective, perhaps, or a policy perspective. Stakeholders are those that have real skin in the game. And we need to be reaching out to those individuals to have a more holistic approach. We talked about relevant deterrence. I think that's extremely important, certainly relevant from the perspective of those that we're trying to deter. But as you pointed out, John, as Chad and Peter have mentioned several times, the relevancy of that deterrence in the eyes of allies, partners, and friends is critically important. If they can't reconcile in their own mind, how is this deterrence, as we, any one country explains it, we as Americans, then we should start thinking twice about how effective it will be. Two last points. Well, I should have mentioned this up front. The point on regime change and containment, we need to stop allowing others to define what our view is. We are all benefited by the rise of China. It's just a mechanism by which they rise. If it's not in accordance with the international rules-based system, let's go through a process, a dialogue about what rules need to change to enable the full rise of China, because that benefits us all. The military, this may be a poor analogy, but I think the military needs to be thought of as a fire department. The fire department, when they pull up to your house, my first question is, what do they know that I don't? I'm sure glad that they're here. Is the garage on fire and I'm not even aware of it? Or my neighbor's house is on fire and there's risk of that fire consuming me? And what does the fire department do? My son's a firefighter. He doesn't spend very much time fighting fires. He spends the vast majority of his time preventing fires. doing house visits to make sure that smoke alarms are appropriately placed and the batteries are in them. That's who, the military, we need to get back to that context of the military. No less competent, no less fully resourced, no less impactful. I'm not saying diminish the military. If anything, it needs to be increased, but to be used for what I think is an important discussion. The last point is this discussion has been exceptional. We need to change that. This discussion needs to be the norm. But unfortunately, there's too few people who have this broad perspective, this practitioner's perspective of the challenges that we face and how to shape it. I think we have the right people in government, very impressed with much of the leadership, down at Chad's level when he was there. There are many more Chads in the DoD than there were when he was there. So feel good about that, Chad, as well as with the State Department. And they're reaching out to allies, partners, and friends as well. And then the last thing, just to foot stomp a comment that you made earlier, John, with respect to the Center for Asia Pacific Strategy. This is what I hope will be a series of panels with different panelists with different subjects that are just as relevant as this one. Bring in those practitioners that can help the CAPS develop policy recommendations of what governments can consider, not just the US government, but other governments as well. So thank you for your indulgence in allowing me to be part of this august panel.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have had, I think, as I have, the privilege and the pleasure to listen to three very august, very learned, and very wise men who are not only have academic and scholarly levels of understanding and framing the issue, but also have been in the weeds and the practical and policy and pragmatic level. It's that perfect combination of an event for me. I hope it has been for you. I'd like to say a very grave and hearty thank you to the Center for Asia Pacific Strategy for hosting this event. And particularly, I'd like at home for all of us to give a hand to our three wonderful panelists. You guys have been really superb. And with that, I've been Dr. John Hemmings, and I hope you will come to our other events, as I say, that will be forthcoming and that you will find written about on the website. And with that, thank you.